Item 2, resumption of the Committee of Supply to consider the estimates for the financial year 1st April 2019 to 31st March 2020.
Head J, Ministry of Defence. The question is that the total sum to be allocated for Head J of the estimates to be reduced by $100. Minister Ng Eng Hen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, let me thank members for their continued commitment to a strong defence for Singapore. I note the speeches that many members in this House have given during the budget debate. It's particularly gratifying and reassuring for our future, for Singapore's future, that despite defence, security, home affairs and foreign affairs accounting for 1/3 of our expenditure, that we've got support across the aisles, across parties. I think that's a strong signal that the future for Singapore bodes well. Last year was a busy year for Singapore. We staged a number of key events on the international efforts. And in response to Mr. Vikram Nair and Ms. Sylvia Lim, I would say that Singapore's image and standing, because we played host, were enhanced. But it also called for extra and stringent security measures here. In June, you remember that the SAF was deployed at short notice. It was yes, on, off. So in 2 weeks, we were asked to host the US DPRK summit. And because such high-profile events can be attractive targets for terrorists, the SAF mounted a large-scale deployment involving 2,000 personnel with dozens of aircraft, ships, vehicles to provide air, land and sea security domes that covered Sentosa and parts of Orchard Road. Our efforts, together with those of the home team, proved a deterrent to would-be provocateurs. The SAF mounted a similar operation when Singapore hosted the ASEAN summit in November, where all the ASEAN heads of governments and many other foreign dignitaries gathered. In October last year, MINDEF chaired the 12th ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting and the 5th 18-member ADMM Plus, which collectively represents 4 billion people and account for 90% of the world's military. That meeting, we galvanized the ADMM Plus countries to address common security concerns, including counterterrorism, chemical, biological, radiological defense threats, and we facilitated ASEAN's adoption of Indonesia's Our Eyes initiative as an initiative which can enhance regional counterterrorism information sharing, and Singapore will assist Indonesia to set up and operate this facility. This is an important initiative as we prepare to deal with the wave of return fighters coming back from Iraq and Syria, even as ISIS loses ground there. I'm glad to report that under our chairmanship, the ADMM adopted the ASEAN Guidelines for Air Military Encounters, GAME. It's the first such set of multilateral guidelines in the world, the support of the Plus countries. GAME can prevent disastrous consequences that can result from unplanned encounters between military aircraft in the air. We've also worked on putting the code for unplanned encounters at sea. I think some members asked about this. It's been put into practice across all ADMM Plus navies, including the inaugural ASEAN-China maritime exercise in October last year. And later this year, we will use queues for the ADMM Plus maritime security exercise, which will include both US and China. All in all, Singapore did its fair share to enhance regional security and stability, and I think on that score, it was a productive and fruitful year. In the last few months, though, we've had our challenges with Malaysia, and Mr. Seah Kim Ping asked about this. Since last November, Malaysian government vessels have repeatedly entered Singapore's territorial waters off Tuas, over which the maritime MPA, the PCG and RSN vessels have exercised jurisdiction and enforcement without any protests or intrusions from Malaysia for more than 2 decades. Even now, 2 Malaysian government vessels continue to be anchored in our territorial waters off Tuas. Singaporeans and MPs are familiar with these developments, and I need not elaborate. Suffice to say, we have strongly cautioned Malaysia to withdraw their vessels. In fact, if you remember, MFA's press statement in December, I'll quote it. Quote, Malaysia's deployments in this area will not strengthen its legal claims and can only heighten tensions. Malaysia will be responsible for any untoward situations on the ground that can arise from continued deployment of its vessel into this area, unquote. And indeed, just as we warned could happen, last month, the Greek bulk carrier Piraeus collided with the Malaysian government vessel Polaris. Mercifully, no bodily harm ensued, but it could have been much worse. Singaporeans will remember the collision between the USS McCain and the oil tanker Alnic of Pedra Branca in August of 2017, where 10 crewmen perished. Even so, some in Malaysia have accused Singapore of orchestrating the collision with the Polaris. These false accusations would have been much more louder and strident to push for retaliation against Singapore and Singaporeans if lives had been lost in the recent collision. Our MFA and transport officials are meeting for discussions and negotiations, and the presence of these Malaysian government vessels does not help in any way, and in fact exposes themselves to danger and obstruct productive talks. The MPA, the PCG and the RSN are closely monitoring activities in Singapore's territorial waters off Tuas 24/7 and will remain ever vigilant to guard our sovereignty and rights under international law. MINDEF will continue its efforts in defense diplomacy. I think members have asked that, including Ms. Sylvia Lim and Mr. Vikram Nair. We want to promote regional peace and stability. We make friends with those who are willing and partner those whose countries whose interests are aligned with ours and who share our desire for inclusiveness, peaceful resolution of disputes, and respect for the law. But at the same time, we must ensure that the SAF is strong and adequate to defend our rights when diplomacy fails and when others choose to do us harm or ignore our rights. As Madam Fatima Latif said, a strong SAF protects Singapore and Singaporeans, and it has been our persistent investments and efforts to build the next generation SAF that can better respond to the security threats for another generation. And these developments are progressing well, and I'd like to elaborate on them. Because many MPs have asked, how do we respond to the different scenarios of threats that will come upon us in this generation? And we have to prepare for the future, and because it takes that period of time to build up the kind of SAF. So first, homeland security. The Mumbai attack in 2008 showed us the devastating destruction that can come from the sea. And we're surrounded by seas. To deter and mitigate external threats against Singapore, we will beef up security for our entire coastline. The SAF will add more optical sensors and coastal radars to deter and detect potential threats. We will build more unmanned watchtowers for better coverage of the busy traffic across the Singapore Strait. We will also add unmanned surface vessels to patrol our waters beginning next year. Members have asked for more details for our modernization of the next generation SAF. Mr. Vikram Nair, Mr. Pritam Singh, Madam Latif, Mr. Chong Ki Hiong, and Mr. Charles Chong. So let me elaborate. Our plans to build the next generation SAF to better respond to security threats are progressing well for all three services. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to display some slides on the LED screens and also ask for the handout to be distributed.
Please do.
Let me begin with our, I'm sure you can see all the features there, but don't worry, the handout is coming. So, let me begin with the air. I think Mr. Henry Quek has asked about the F-35s. We have announced our plans to replace the F-16s, which will face obsolescence post-2030, with the F-35s. This will mean that the RSAF fighter fleet will consist of F-35 and F-15 SGs if plans come to fruition a decade or so from now. As stated previously, MINDEF will issue a letter of request, LOR, to the U.S. to acquire F-35s. As required by U.S. law for foreign military sales, the U.S. Congress must approve the sale of F-35s. Our LOR will request an initial acquisition of 4 F-35s with the option of a subsequent 8 if we decide to proceed. Singapore has the endorsement of both the United States administration and the Department of Defense for our proposed purchase of F-35s, but the Congress must still approve it. In fact, President Trump wrote to Prime Minister Lee last month welcoming Singapore's plans to acquire the F-35. During my meeting with Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan at the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago, he also said that the U.S. was greatly appreciative of Singapore's decision and his department supported it. A word on price. The price of F-35s has been steadily falling due to the healthy orders from the U.S. and 10 other countries, including the UK, Italy, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. DSTA's assessment is that now is an opportune time to put in Singapore's requests. The current unit price of the F-35 ranges from US 90 million to US 150 million per aircraft, comparable to what we have paid for our F-15 SGs. The total cost of ownership of a fleet of F-35s, including maintenance across its lifespan, will also be similar to our F-15 SGs. Nonetheless, MINDEF will continue to work with the U.S. Department of Defense to optimize operating and maintenance costs. The RSAF will take delivery of new helicopters from 2020 onwards. The H-225M medium lift and our Chinook heavy lift helicopters will replace our existing Super Pumas and our CH-47D fleets. These new helicopters will add capacity and be more effective in search and rescue or humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. That's for the Air Force. Let me move on to the Navy. For the RSN, our submarines in operation are over 2 decades old. We will replace them with 4 new Invincible-class submarines. The first was recently launched in Germany, with the other 3 being built. The Invincible-class submarines will have longer endurance and also the latest locally developed sensors and automated systems designed for optimal use in our surrounding waters. We've launched our submarines lately in Kiel, facing the North Sea. We launched our previous class of submarines in the Baltic Sea, but you know, those cold waters there are much colder. So we have to optimize them for our warm waters here. We aim to have a full fleet of 4 Invincible-class submarines by 2025. For surface ships, our aging missile corvettes have served with distinction since 1989. They are also pioneer generation and will have to be retired soon. And they will be replaced by the new multi-role combat vessels. The first of these will be delivered around 2025, with full delivery expected 2030. More than just improving capabilities, the new multi-role combat vessels will incorporate many new ideas. First of all, they will use less manpower. I think many MPs have pointed out, how do we deal with the 1/3 reduction in manpower? The MRCVs will use less manpower, about half the size of that found in modern frigates, which is quite an achievement. This is possible because we designed it from the onset, custom built for lean manning, using technologies which automate many functions, including maintenance. And as a result, there's also a cost savings of up to 10% in operating them, compared to other similar-sized frigates. The MRCVs will also have unmanned air and sea drones. So it wouldn't be just a manned ship, it will have air and sea drones, modular packages to extend their reach and flexibility against threats. Many of you are familiar with LSTs, our landing ship tanks, I think many of you have sailed on them, and they've proved their worth time and again. Each time we deploy them in exercises, we say, we're so grateful that we have this platform, so versatile and able to meet mission objectives. It's been the workhorse in our HADR efforts and other missions. The LSTs are aging too and will need to be replaced in the next decade by larger and more flexible joint multi-mission ships. Let me move on to the Army. For the Army, the next generation armored fighting vehicle will replace our M113 Ultras as the mainstay of SAF's mechanized force from this year onwards. Singaporeans will see them soon on our roads at this year's NDP. These armored fighting vehicles have better armor protection and mobility through urban environments. Another addition to the Army will be the next generation howitzers, which have an extended range and greater precision strikes compared to our current platforms. I've talked about air, land and sea manned platforms, but the signature change, I think, for the SAF of 2030 and beyond is that the SAF will become more of a hybrid force. We will use many more unmanned platforms. Some of the RSAF's unmanned aerial vehicles have been operating for more than a decade, and they were replaced by newer UAVs with better capabilities over the next few years. I mentioned the MRCV's unmanned surface vessels too. But in the Army, soldiers within the Army will soon use micro UAVs, your own UAV or your UAV for your unit, for the first time, which will be particularly useful in built-up and urban environments. These unmanned platforms will complement traditional manned equipment to enhance responses across a full range of operational scenarios. In all, the next generation SAF of 2030 and beyond, with this full complement of assets in air, land and sea, will be able to defend Singapore for another generation. This is the SAF that will take us into and guard our future. This is the SAF that our investments have bought or will buy. This is the SAF on air, land and sea with which the next generation of Singaporeans will celebrate for SG 75. By then, we will have a state-of-the-art coastal surveillance network and air defense systems to form a shield around Singapore against incoming threats. The RSAF will fly F-35s and F-15s over our skies, supported by A330 multi-role tanker transport aircraft, G550 airborne early warning aircraft, new helicopters, and a host of new UAVs. The RSN will have multi-role combat vessels, invincible class submarines. One wishes they were invisible too. Invincible class submarines, new unmanned surface vessels, and larger joint multi-mission ships, in addition to existing frigates and littoral mission vessels. The Army will be more protected and mobile, with soldiers mounted in the next generation armored fighting vehicles and Terex motorized vehicles. Leopard tanks, HIMARS, and next generation howitzers will support them, complemented by a full suite of combat engineers, signals, logistics, and maintenance platforms. But hardware alone won't build you a strong army and a strong military. We will have to have new training facilities both here and overseas, which will ensure that our NS men and regulars can build a modern and capable SAF that can defend Singapore and our interests. And I know members here have asked that, Mr. Zainal Sapari, among others. The SAF for 2030 and beyond has been designed to be operated with a leaner manpower pool. Mr. Bayam King, Mr. Chong Ki-Hiong, Mr. Zainal Sapari, and Mr. Pritam Singh asked about this. In other words, we designed the SAF of 2030 and beyond to work with a reduction of a manpower supply by a third after 2030. I've already mentioned the MRCV vessels for the Navy, which needs the smaller crew. The next generation howitzer that I earlier mentioned will only need 3 men to operate, compared to 9 now. So it's a significant reduction. And yet, the next generation howitzer will fire more rounds accurately per minute. Autonomous and automated systems will reduce labor-intensive tasks, for example, runway damage assessment of our air bases and airstrips. The modern systems and platforms of the SAF can also be operated by NS men who are not PES A or B, and therefore effectively increase our utilization of manpower pool. Pari passu with the acquisition of hardware, we'll also invest more into training facility for SAF soldiers. I last spoke to this House about Safety City in 2017. The Pioneer and Merdeka generation are all too familiar with the old Safety. You remember Fofo Hill, Pingkang Hill, Pasir Laba, Boat Shed, Elephant Hill. We charge up them and sometimes charge down them. Well, Safety City will complement these traditional terrains with urban settings to better prepare our soldiers for a wide variety of operations in the 21st century. Safety City will be a wired city. We talked about a smart city. We're hoping that Safety City will be a smart training ground. We'll use more simulation, detailed monitoring to help our soldiers learn better. It'll be a far cry from the days that we did our NS and charged up hills or against enemy battalions shouting bang, 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 bang. And they shouted bang, 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 bang back. The method is not new. For instance, our fighter pilots have been using this for decades to train for high-speed maneuvers. So after every maneuver, they sit down and say, all right, you say what you did, he says what he did. This is the objective. They show the tracks, they show where your weaknesses. And they've been able to do that because planes are expensive and pilots even more so. But it is only now that modern technology allows us to scale this up for the same processes for individual soldiers within the army. So we have been doing this over the years where you can no longer assume that you've hit the target and you've actually have electric sensors on soldiers, on platforms, and attrition rate is real. And I'm glad to report that Safety City is taking shape and on schedule. We'll build more roads and bridges so that motorized and mechanized troops in the army vehicles can start training this year. Safety City will be progressively built, and when finished, we'll have more than 200 buildings of varying heights and types when completed, all wired up. But with this kind of SAF for 2030 and beyond, which can move at great distances, our Terexes can move 70 kilometers an hour, and our Leopards close to that. Slower, perhaps, across more difficult terrain. But if we only had space to train in Singapore, you could reach one end to the other within less than one hour. So we'll need larger training spaces. In particular, the training areas at Shoalwater Bay will be expanded. There will be new developments in Townsville region in northeast Australia. And under the Singapore-Australia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, new facilities such as instrumented combined arms, air-land ranges, and urban operations live firing facilities are on track to being built. I've said that very quickly, but an air-land range is priceless. It allows, we can only do this in very few places now, some in the US because they have the land, but it allows for coordinated strikes between land and air platforms. So when these facilities are completed over the coming years, we will be able to train large groups of troops for up to 18 weeks annually, a significant increase from the current 6 to 7 weeks, about a threefold increase. Many members have talked about digital defense. I completely agree. It's a battlefront that we cannot choose to ignore, or we ignore at our peril. I think Mr. Charles Chong, Mr. Desmond Chu, Madam Fatima Latif, Mr. Tan Wu Meng have spoken about this. I spoke to this House about the threat of hybrid warfare and its effect on the real world previously. We've seen this played out against the Baltic states and the Ukraine, to name some. And as a culturally and ethnically diverse nation, we too are vulnerable to such hybrid attacks, including targeting of our IT networks to disrupt services and capabilities. Members have asked what's our progress of protecting this front and building up a force to protect this front. 2 years ago, I announced the setup of the Defense Cyber Organization, DCO. DCO has stood up the Defence Cyber Security Centre. In other words, we have a Defence Cyber Security within MINDEF and the SAF for daily operations against cyber threats, against MINDEF, SAF, IT systems, especially our command and control computer networks. In place are incident response teams which can also be deployed to support other national agencies during cyber attacks on critical systems. To meet these needs, the SAF has to expand the pool of regulars from the cyber domain for the cyber domain, and there will be MDES personnel, military domain expert scheme, as well as non-uniform defense cyber experts. We've recently announced that more than 300 will be hired in the first phase. But NSS too can play an important part in digital defense, just as they do for kinetic operations. I think that was a point by Mr. Zainal Sapari and Mr. Vikram Nair. The 59-strong pioneer batch of the Cyber NSF scheme enlisted in late 2018 after passing 2 rounds of vigorous tests. They are now undergoing an 8-month-long cyber specialist cadet corps in partnership with the Singapore Institute of Technology and will graduate this August. We expect to take in another 80 to 90 cyber specialists this year to beef up our cyber units. Just as we've done for kinetic operations, many of you are familiar with our SAF firing ranges. Many of you have fired there. Well, we have a cyber range as well. The Cyber Defense Test and Evaluation Center. In this cyber range, our cyber soldiers are exposed to realistic training. We've created a mock-up, a simulation of SAF's networks and online traffic. And we actually use actual malware and attacks against these nodes. And like in firing ranges, you're supposed to shoot straight. The SAF aims to train soldiers that can respond to these attacks in a realistic and challenging environment. The SAF will also tap on NS men with IT expertise as a result of their civilian jobs or training. One example is the existing NS expertise conversion scheme. It allows non-officers, NS men with industry expertise to become MDES officers for cyber vocations. We are exploring, MINDEF and the SAF are exploring better matching of NS men with their civilian IT vocations. All of us have a part to play in digital defense or total defense, and in Singapore's digital fortress, we are only as strong as the weakest link, and SMS Maliki will share more. These acquisitions in hardware and facilities, together with the will and skills of our NS men and NSFs that make up the bulk of the SAF, will put us in a good position to deal with security challenges for another generation. If it comes to pass, if all these plans come to pass, and I will add, it will take us 10 to 15 years, the SAF will be one of the more capable militaries in the region. Our NSFs and NSmen will be able to train well and, most importantly, must train safely. The Inspector General for Safety has been recently appointed and the office expanded with more safety officers. A number of members talked about safety. Mr. Charles Chong, Mr. Chong Ki-hong, Mr. Zainal Sapari. The commanding officers of individual units have also been charged with the responsibility and accountability of safety standards and outcomes. As a routine, the CEO must identify activities each day that pose higher safety risks to his servicemen and women, and satisfy himself that the safety response plan and mitigating measures for such activities are adequate. Safety is more than ever a command responsibility, but each soldier must play his role too. And we are doing this so that we can have realistic training. Because if you can't train safely, you'll be set back. SMS Heng will address in greater detail the measures the SAF will take to achieve zero training fatalities. MINDEF has also decided to build a central facility to better respond to the needs of the NS community. A new NS hub, a national service hub, will be built. It will bring together different services which are now scattered across Singapore. For example, today, pre-enlistees take their IPPT at, say, Toa Payoh Stadium, then go to Depot Road, CMPB, and then attend medical reviews at the MMI and the Military Medicine Unit in Kentridge. Well, the new NS Hub will take all these services scattered across the island and put them into a central location. Where is this magical central location? It will be opposite Cashew MRT station with easy access. The NS Hub will be built as a smart complex using modern technology for seamless, user-friendly experience. Opposite Cashew MRT and MINDEF land. Don't worry, we won't take it anybody else. Construction will begin this year, and our national servicemen can look forward to their NS Hub by 2023. And as Senior Minister State Heng Chee How will elaborate the other measures to enhance the NS experience. Mr. Chairman, let me conclude. To develop such a capable SAF that I've just described, which can protect Singapore's interests and keep Singaporeans safe for another generation, will require significant and steady investments. I make no bones about it. It will require resources and our commitment. I'm grateful to members of this House and Singaporeans for their steadfast and unwavering support towards a strong SAF. As I have previously committed to this House, we expect our nominal defense spending over the next decade to grow at 3 to 4% each year, to at least keep pace with inflation. Now, this year's budget represented a 4.8% increase over last year. The commitment that I've put over the next decade of 3 to 4% holds, despite this year's increase. There were just certain projects or acquisitions that matured, and therefore we had to spend more. However, the overall defense expenditure will even out in subsequent years. Defense, especially for a small island like Singapore, is crucial. Singapore is on track to build a modernized tri-service SAF and perhaps even a quadri-service SAF, including the cyber force, that can meet security challenges both in the real and virtual worlds in the 21st century. If we continue our steady investments into defense, and our NS men maintain their commitment and resolve to defend Singapore, then our future will be secure for another generation. We can look forward to celebrate SG 75 with the assurance that we have strong defenses. Thank you.